STEAM series. STEAM is an acronym. It stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Mathematics. It's a very eclectic theme. We actually welcome people from all disciplines to come and share their interests with us. So we're glad that you're here to join us. This series is very much a collaboration among three organizations: Denison University, Granville Public Library, and also OSU at Newark. And I have two collaborators that make all of these things possible for us. And they include, from the Granville Public Library, Lucy Chin Parker. You can wave for us, Lucy. There you are, okay. And from OSU-Newark, we have Dr. Mike Stamatikos. So thank you, Mike. We will have some upcoming sessions on November 11 and December 14th. Those are the second Tuesdays of those months. And to say a little bit about maybe the November 11th session and also perhaps some instructions to students, I'd like to turn the floor over for the moment to Mike. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Nestor. Good evening to everyone. Happy you're being with us today. A little bit about November's speaker. Dr. Tiki Morris, who's an associate professor from the Ohio State University, will be talking about setting the record straight, Black women's social justice activism. And she comes to us from the Department of African American and African Studies, and also serves as the co-founder and co-director of the Ohio Prison Education Exchange Program. Very excited to have her next month. Please tune in for that. And for students of Astronomy 1143, if you can please text me your OSU name.number in the chat, I'll be able to give you credit appropriately for attending this evening. Back to you, Nestor.
Okay, Mike, thanks very much. Looking forward to the November session. That sounds like it's going to be great. A little word about the December session. We're going to have a December 14th session. Again, that's the second Tuesday of that month. And our guests that evening are going to be the members of Ethel. Ethel is a string quartet that often serves as the artists in residence here at Denison. And it'll be fun to hear about their interactions with Denison students and Denison faculty and some of the other musical escapades that our friends Ethel have been up to. So string quartet on December 14th. Just a little word about how these sessions run. In just a moment, I'll introduce tonight's speaker, and we'll go for maybe 30-ish minutes. This is all very informal. And then we'll open up the floor to questions. We prefer, when possible, during the question and answer period, we think it's best to have the questioners unmute themselves and ask the question directly. It keeps it nice and interactive. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Drexler James. Dr. James earned a Bachelor of Science in Psychology with a minor in biology at the Illinois Institute of Technology. From there, he went on to the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he earned advanced degrees in psychology, a master's degree, and a PhD, both in social psychology. In August of 2018, Dr. James joined us here on the faculty at Denison University, where he is an assistant professor of psychology. Dr. James teaches many courses. These include Introduction to Psychology, Research Methods and Statistics, Cultural Psychology and its companion research course, and very interesting upper-level seminars, one on race in the age of genomics and one on stigma. Tonight, Dr. James will address an important question: how does stigma get under the skin? Welcome, Dr. James.
Oh, thank you, Nesta, for the wonderful introduction. So as Nesta said, today my talk will be on how stigma gets under the skin, and I'll focus specifically on racial stigma. I also just began some work on homophobia or sexual orientation-based stigma. So I'll just start off by having you think of this one question Gordon Allport asked many years ago. Okay, so just like think about this throughout the talk. What would happen to your personality if you heard it said over and over again that you are lazy and of inferior blood? So think about, throughout your life, hearing someone or just like culturally being aware of those like negative stereotypes about your group. Okay, so that falls under the domain of stigma. So stigma, when we think about stigma, stigma involves four processes. So here we have labels, we have groups of people, and those groups are created oftentimes by those in power. And stereotypes and the label attached to those differences here creates the groups. And when we oftentimes talk about stigma, we think about those negative stereotypes. And the negative stereotypes, negative attitudes towards individuals based on their group membership, oftentimes there leads to discrimination, okay? So part of stigma here, we have stereotypes and prejudices, and we also have discrimination. And the form of stigma that I focus on in my research is self-stigma, when the individual here begins to believe those negative cultural stereotypes about the group. And as I said here, I focus on race stigma, and I'll talk about that broadly. But first, I'll just introduce here the context of like my research. So I study racial disparities and also sexual minority health disparities, so health and mental health. And I'm just focusing here specifically on COVID right now. As we know, just like broadly, racial ethnic minorities in the US fare worse on like multiple matrices of like health. So physical health, mental health. Racial ethnic minorities tend to have a shorter life expectancy, report poorer mental, physical, and dental health. And even here in the current COVID pandemic, we know that racial ethnic minorities are more likely to be diagnosed with COVID, more likely to be hospitalized as a result of COVID, and more likely to die from COVID. So if you're just paying attention to the news in the past 2 years, these discussions on racial health disparities have been huge, okay? And one of the drivers of this like desperate health outcomes among racial ethnic minorities compared to non-Hispanic whites is racism. Okay, so I'm using here this very multi-level definition, operationalization of racism. So racism is an organized social system in which the dominant racial group, based on an ideology of inferiority, categorizes and ranks people into social groups called races, and uses its power to devalue, disempower, and differentially allocate valued societal resources and opportunities to groups defined as inferior. So here we're seeing we have operating the interpersonal, so discrimination, the self-stigma, and also the institutional systemic definitions of racism. So that's why I like this definition. So similar to thinking about stigma broadly as introduced by Allport, we can also think about racism at multiple levels. Okay, so oftentimes when you think of racism, the average person thinks of discrimination, so interpersonal racism. There's been increasing discussions now on institutionalized and or systemic racism. Okay, so institutionalized racism here, we have policies or practices in society. Personally mediated racism here captures prejudice and discrimination, so this interpersonal bias. And this third form of racism that's oftentimes not discussed is internalized racism, and that's what I study. So internalized racism here is this internalization and endorsement of those racial stereotypes. So here, internalized racism is a form of racism that leads people to internalize stereotypes about their racial ethnic group, okay? So that's racial self-stigma. And you probably haven't heard about internalized racism because it's not really studied a lot, it's not discussed. We oftentimes hear about interpersonal racism or discrimination. So I'll just like present this context here. So we have, over the years, a lot of evidence documenting the relationship between racism and health, and racism and health really focus on the institutional and the personally mediated, so discrimination forms. But research that examines the relationship between internalized racism or this like internalized racial self-stigma and health is not really done. Okay, so I'll just give some more context. So when you're thinking about the accumulated evidence documenting the relationship between internalized racism and health outcomes, there's only been one meta-analysis published. So one meta-analysis here showing that internalized racism is associated with poor physical and mental health, okay? And that was published last year. And there's only ever been 2 systematic reviews examining here the relationship between internalized racism and just health outcomes broadly. So talking about moderators and mechanisms. And again, here, both the systematic reviews were published last year. So most of the evidence, the cumulative evidence we have about on internalized racism was only published last year. So of the systematic reviews, one of them I published. Okay, so I reviewed 28 years, 28 years of research and quantitative research on internalized racism and health among racial ethnic minorities. And that 28 years, I think 1990 to 2018, covered 112 studies. So my research here just focuses on identifying some of those mechanisms associated with internalized racism and health, and discussing like some of the limitations of the current literature and identifying like moderators, okay? So I know this is like a broad overview situating you with the research on racism and just like health outcomes. So, and we'll get to the part of like, how does the stigma, this racial stigma, get under the skin to affect health outcomes? Okay, so this is a framework by Williams and Mohammed here that really captures how racism gets under the skin to affect health outcomes. So we can think of the interaction between the basic causes, social status, proximal pathways, how people respond to experiencing racism at these multiple levels, and those like health outcomes that I discussed earlier on. Okay, so what we were thinking, I want you to just orient yourself here to the proximal pathways. So we're thinking again of this like multiple levels of stigma, multiple levels of racial stigma. So we have our stigma, prejudice, and stereotypes. You know, experiencing discrimination leads to stress. So racism is a stressor, and we can talk about it more at the end if you want. You can also think about the socioeconomic consequences of racism and differential allocation of resources. But I'm bringing this up because of how internalized racism is discussed in the literature currently. So we see here that internalized racism is a response, or is an operation as a conceptualized as a response to experiencing discrimination. So going back here to the initial quote, you know, what would happen to your personality if you're told over and over again that you are inferior and or if you're lazy and of inferior blood? So this is the idea here that this like repeated exposure to those like negative cultural stereotypes, being discriminated against because of your racial group membership, at some point might lead the individual to believe that, you know what, maybe it's true. Maybe I am a lazy person. Maybe it is a bad thing that I'm Black. Maybe being Black is a bad thing. Maybe being a racial ethnic minority is worse than being part of the majority group. And I'll discuss towards the end here, well, although a lot of the research on internalized racism focuses on like negative stereotypes, I argue that the model minority myth, so focusing here on Asian Americans, where the stereotypes seem positive, but they also have negative consequences. Again, and I'll discuss that later on. So the idea here is that experiencing discrimination leads an individual here to believe those negative stereotypes about themselves and the group, which then influences their attitudes and behaviors, and that has downstream health consequences, okay? So now I'm just gonna give like an overview of like research on this internalized racism. So we have Du Bois, Clark and Clark, Fanon, and Cross, and I'll just like go through it just in this like sequence. So we had Du Bois, who talked about double consciousness. So this idea that specifically for African Americans in the US, they seem to live in this, well, double state of being American, but also here being Black. And basically what Du Bois argued was, it's very difficult for an African American in the US to have a strong Black identity because Blackness in the US is seen so negatively. Okay, so what we're saying here is to be American as a Black person, you also at some point have to embody the anti-Blackness that's part of American culture, because Blackness in the US is defined by the majority group, and the stereotypes are negative. Ergo, if you're thinking about being a Black person, if you're thinking about Blackness and Black identity, we also have to account for those negative stereotypes. And so Clark and Clark, I'm sure most of you have probably heard of the Clark and Clark doll studies. Although this like study here was really based on making arguments for differences in self-esteem among white children versus Black children, it's oftentimes seen here as the first empirical study on internalized racism. So basically the Clark and Clark study, Black children were given dolls, either a white doll and a Black doll, and were asked which doll they preferred. Most of the Black children selected the white doll. You know, so Clark and Clark concluded here that this shows how discrimination leads to low self-esteem among racial ethnic minority children. Others have reinterpreted this to say that, again, because of socialization processes, we're seeing here the Black children preferring the white doll or preferring whiteness. So Fanon broadened this idea of internalized racism and talked about internalized colonialism. So not just thinking about race in the US, but thinking about colonialism itself. So we think of the process of colonialism where a foreign entity comes into a space and like redefines society, redefines institutions, and creates a hierarchy of like preference. So on the one hand, although it may not be directly related to race, we can also see this process happening among people who've been colonized. And yes, there is a almost a one-to-one with like race differences and colonial history, but we can think about this processes very differently. And then further on, leading or studying internalized racism as a form of identity among African Americans. We have cross coming here with the Negressans Model. So it's a 5-stage model where the first stage of identity development for African Americans is the stage where Black Americans have negative attitudes towards being Black, and over time they develop their acceptance. Okay, so those are just like ways people have thought about internalized racism. But contemporarily here, this internalized racial stigma is thought about as racial ethnic minorities believing those often negative racist beliefs about their group. Okay, so a Black person here believing, for example, that they're athletic. Although it doesn't seem like it's a negative stereotype, there is research to suggest that Black children who believe they're more athletic are less likely to want to seek or further their education. Okay, so you can see how stereotypes, even though they're seemingly positive, might also be constraining. And we know based on previous research too, that this internalized racial stigma influences how people perceive themselves and also the group. Okay, so an individual might prefer or want to be white, might hate being Black, or individuals might perceive, for example, a Black person might also perceive other Black people as being lazy. So we see here influencing self-perception and in-group perception. Okay. So again, when we're thinking about what this internalized self-stigma is, it manifests multiple ways. Oftentimes they're attributing superiority to the dominant group, feeling inferior because you're part of a minority group, or this consequences, psychological consequences of like low self-worth, negative self-concept, and self-hatred. And this last part here, this like self-evaluative consequences of racism is what I focus on, okay? And I'll just like skip here. Okay, so what I've done, so I'm just thinking about this relationships and documenting here this quantitatively the relationship between discrimination and internalized racism. So in the first paper I published on internalized racism is a nationally representative data set of African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans in the US. And what I found was that those who reported more experiences with just like everyday discrimination, so being mistreated because of their race, were more likely here to internalize racism. So again, so have these negative attitudes towards being Black. Okay, so just documenting that there is this positive relationship between experiencing discrimination and those like negative feelings about being a racial minority. But through my research, I've been interested in this like mechanisms. So what explains here this relationship between internalized racism and health outcomes among Black Americans? So really now here getting into how does stigma get under the skin? So thinking again back to that initial quote, what you've told over and over again, that you're lazy and of inferior blood. What might happen? You might begin to believe it, and it'll influence how you feel about yourself. So think about the self-evaluative processes. So to understand or to really frame this research question, I turn to social identity threat. Okay, so introducing some like psych theory here. So social identity threat is broadly defined as threat that people experience in situations where they feel devalued on the basis of their social identity. So in this case here, the social identity is race. People feel devalued. And this experience of social identity threat could lead to multiple attitudinal and behavioral consequences. So here, if you constantly feel that you're devalued because of your social group membership, it might lead to more negative self-concept. So you might feel bad about yourself. It might be reflected in you having lower self-esteem, lower self-perceived worth. Okay, and this social identity threat, again, feeling devalued because of your social group membership, might also lead her into more negative coping responses. So as a way to cope here with this negative emotional state, individuals might be more likely to engage in self-harm or risky sexual behavior, drinking, smoking, etc., etc. Okay, so again, here, my research and thinking about how does this racial stigma get under the skin, I turn to social identity threat and argue then that perhaps what explains this relationship between internalized racism and health is this self-evaluative or self-concept consequences. So this being devalued because of your race might lead you to think very negatively about yourself, that then has downstream health consequences, and or this feeling devalued because of your race might lead you to engage in more negative coping behaviors. And again, that has downstream consequences. Okay, so good. Okay. So in my first study here, so the first hypothesized pathway, I argued that, this core self-evaluations, how you feel about yourself, explains the relationship between internalized racism and health. And that was based on previous work showing that those who've internalized racism, so have negative attitudes towards being a racial ethnic minority, also report lower self-esteem. And other work showing that this core self-evaluations, how we feel about ourselves, also has negative consequences here for our health. So if you have a negative self-concept, you also then are more likely to report more negative health outcomes. So I focus specifically, and I'll come back to this image, I focus specifically on core self-evaluation. So core self-evaluations include self-esteem, so global positive evaluations of the self, emotional stability or neuroticism, okay, the extent to which an individual is likely to experience negative moods and negative emotions. We have generalized self-efficacy, so you can conceptualize this as perceived self-competence, and locus of control, the extent to which individuals believe that they're in control of their own life outcomes. So in this paper, I tested the hypothesis that internalized racism here leads to these negative self-concepts, and these negative self-concepts then lead to increased depression and anxiety symptoms. Okay, so I found partial support for this hypothesis, which I think was interesting. So what I found here, the relationship between internalized racism and depression and anxiety was explained by self-esteem and emotional stability. Okay, what does that mean? What it means is that those who report higher internalized racism reported lower self-esteem, and as a result here, greater anxiety and depression symptoms. Those who reported higher internalized racism were also more emotionally unstable, which also increased anxiety and depression symptoms, associated with anxiety and depression symptoms. I did not find here that this relationship between internalized racism and either anxiety or depression was explained by generalized self-efficacy. So this global beliefs about self-competence and locus of control, the extent to which an individual believes they're in control of their life outcomes. So altogether, this is the conclusion that I made. So again, here, thinking about how the stigma gets under the skin. So I argued in this paper that it seems that the relationship between internalized racism and those mental health outcomes is driven by the more affective than motivational components of core self-evaluation. So what does that mean? Okay, what it means here is that internalized racism leads an individual to think very badly about themselves. And those negative self-concepts here lead to poorer mental health outcomes. But it does not seem like internalized racism leads an individual to believe that they're incapable or they're not in control of their life. Okay, so again here, it seems that how the stigma, this racial stigma gets under the skin is by affecting how individuals think about themselves. Okay, so we go in here with this social identity threat leading to those negative self-evaluations that leads here to these poor mental health outcomes. Okay, so it's about how you feel about yourself, which makes sense. Okay, I've also been currently a paper I'm working with interested in testing here this second pathway where I argue that internalized racism leads to those negative coping behaviors, which then has downstream health consequences, okay? And previous research has documented that those who've internalized racism are more likely to use drugs, more likely here to use alcohol. And as we know, negative coping behaviors are increased risk to poor health outcomes. But in this study here, I was really focused on an intersectional demographic. So whereas I'd focus on just African Americans, just broadly defined, in this study here, I was focused on African American men who have sex with men, okay? So people who are both racial minorities and also sexual minorities. And again, I studied this population because of this poor health outcomes, specifically here, sexual health outcomes, where Black men who have sex with men at increased risk here of HIV compared to all other demographic groups, okay? So in this paper here, I was interested in the extent to which internalized racism is related to those like sexual health outcomes. So HIV diagnosis. So HIV diagnosis here is has the individual ever been diagnosed with HIV as one dependent variable, or just any STD or STI, including HIV. So in this study here, I gave participants a list of like 10 common STDs, including HIV, and they just answered yes, no, if they've ever been diagnosed, okay? So in this paper here, I tested whether this increased engagement in risky sexual behavior here explained the relationship between internalized racism and STD diagnosis or HIV diagnosis, okay? So here, testing the hypothesis that internalized racism increases engagement here in these negative coping behaviors, okay? So what did I find? I didn't find any direct relationship between internalized racism and sexual health outcomes, which makes sense. There's nothing about internalized racism necessarily that would lead an individual to be diagnosed with HIV. But confirming hypothesis here, what I found was this engagement in risky sexual behavior explained the relationship between internalized racism and HIV diagnosis and STD/STI diagnosis. Okay, again, what does this mean? Thinking again about the quote, like what would happen to your personality if you're told over and over again. What we're seeing here is the individuals with higher levels of internalized racism were more likely here to engage in risky sexual behavior. So things like condomless sex or using drugs and alcohol during sex. And this increased engagement in risky sexual behavior increased the likelihood or the odds that be diagnosed with HIV, and also here increased the odds that be diagnosed with any STD or any common STD or STI out of 10. Okay, so we're seeing here the second pathway being supported, where negative coping behaviors. But why negative coping behaviors? We know here that perhaps the negative coping behavior, people engage in these negative coping behaviors as a way to deal with the negative, like self-evaluative consequences of internalized racism. So if you internalize racism, you have this negative self-perception and you want to feel better about yourself. So you might be more likely to use drugs, use alcohol, and in this case here, more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. Okay, so we're seeing here a complicated pathway of internalized racism and its health outcomes. Cool. Okay, and I'll just like go through it just quickly here to just like talk about how it gets under the skin. So when you're thinking about internalized racism or this like stigma and think about how it gets under the skin, there are multiple processes or steps involved. Okay, we're thinking about this like core self-evaluations. People think or hold negative views about themselves. This negative views about themselves influences their behavior, so they might more likely engage in risky behavior that then increases their risk to poor mental health outcomes, and as we saw, to poor sexual health outcomes, okay? So I've also been thinking about other ways in which internalized racism influences those health outcomes. So in addition to thinking about self-evaluations, thinking about other psychosocial factors like hopelessness, okay? Hopelessness, think about why try, and thinking about that. My undergrad and I did some studies over the summer, really conceptually replicating the same findings with internalized homophobia. Well, we found a similar process here. So individuals who are non-heterosexual, who endorse these negative stereotypes about non-heterosexual individuals, also here lead to this like negative self-perceptions. These negative self-perceptions increases risk of depression symptoms that then lead to greater suicide ideation. So thinking about the mortality consequences of internalizing stigma. So overall, what I find is this complex relationship between internalized stigma and health outcomes. So how does it get under the skin? So an individual here experiences discrimination. So you're thinking about discrimination, socialization processes where they're told over and over again that they're not good enough or there's something wrong with them because of their group membership, which leads them here to internalize or believe those negative cultural stereotypes about their group. So think here the social identity threat. Okay, if we're using social identity threat as a framework here, it seems that one of the driving factors is this negative self-perception. Okay, people are told or they believe those negative things about themselves because of their group membership, which leads them to view themselves very negatively. So this low self-esteem, low emotional stability. I also have evidence here for increased hopelessness. And these self-evaluations there have consequences for health attitudes and health behaviors, okay? In another study, I found that those negative self-evaluations might lead individuals to also hold negative health attitudes. So people who report lower self-esteem are less likely to report positive attitudes towards seeking professional psychological help services. We also see this relationship with internalized racism. Those with internalized racism and even internalized homophobia are less likely to express positive attitudes towards seeking medical help. And those have downstream consequences. If you're less likely, if you hold more negative attitudes towards seeking professional medical help, you're actually less likely to go to a doctor or visit a mental health professional, which then is associated with this poor health outcomes broadly. We've also seen here those behavioral consequences of internalizing stigma, okay? So people might engage in negative coping behaviors as one way to deal with the psychological consequences of stigma. And as we saw here, downstream health consequences. Okay, so broadly here, that captures how internalized racism broadly and stigma generally gets under the skin. Okay, it affects individuals psychologically, which also then has consequences for how they think about their health, how they act, so engaging in health promoting or health risky behavior. Yeah, so I tried to give like a 10,000 view hair talk on like internalized stigma and health, but because I can go on, forever about it, and it becomes very like difficult to talk about without going into the nuances and the history of it, because you can think about conceptualizing internalized racism in multiple ways, and because of time, I didn't go through it, but it's very like complicated. As you can see here, how we can operationalize it. So when we say internalized racism, we're talking about a conscious process. Are people aware that they've internalized racism, or is it an unconscious process? Is it something that happens in the moment, or is it a way that people just internalize racism across years, months, weeks, etc.? Okay. When we think about internalized racism, as I said, are we only thinking about the negative stereotypes, or should we also discuss positive stereotypes? So going back to the model minority myth, where overwhelmingly stereotypes about Asian Americans are seemingly positive, but there is work to suggest that Asian Americans who endorse or believe those positive stereotypes are more likely here to be psychologically distressed, so reporting those poor mental health outcomes. The idea here is that stereotypes are constraining. So it doesn't matter if the stereotype is positive or negative. If you have a stereotype about your group, there is a pressure to behave or act within the parameters of that stereotype. And that is stress-inducing, and that can lead to those negative health outcomes. When we're also thinking about internalized racism, is it always about the self? Does the individual always hate the fact that they're Black, or is the individual hating other Black people? So those are some of the discussions that are currently going on in the literature. But I argue that the research on internalized racism, just relative to other forms of racism, is just like lacking. So we have a lot of questions, about it. It's stable, unstable. How do people internalize racism? What does it look like in children, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, and I'll just end here.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. In just a moment, we'll invite people to unmute themselves and ask questions. It might be a good idea if you'd like to raise a hand using the reactions. I think you'll have the opportunity to raise a hand there, or if you'd like to send me a message in the chat that you would like to speak. But until we get somebody who's ready to ask a question, I just want to thank Dr. James for overviewing so much important work. I realize he summarized a tremendous amount of work in a short period of time. And we thank you for putting all of that together. I have to say, you offered a very compelling opening question. I don't think I would want to hear over and over and over again that I was lazy or that I had inferior blood. I mean, that's really an important way to frame this. And so I thank you for that provocative start. I'm looking out over the audience that I can see, and it's delightful to see that we've got faculty from across the university, and we have people from the township and from OSU. I see that we have a One of our own alums from the class of 2010, my 2006 Juno buddy, who is now a clinical psychologist, is with us. And so we have a very eclectic group here, which is great. Let me see if we have, yeah, maybe that's best. If we just go to this view, and we'll see if we have any questions. Feel free to raise a hand or to just put your name in the chat if you'd like to be called upon. In the meantime, what I think I can do is ask a question just to get us started. I was interested in many of the things you had to say, Dr. James, including the reference to locus of control. And what I was just hoping you might be able to say a little bit about is that some of the folks on this Zoom call will know about locus of control, but others are newer to that construct, and it wasn't always clear to me which way that was coded, whether, for example, having a more internalized locus of control is associated with a higher, a better health outcome. That would be my guess, but I wonder if you can say a little bit about locus of control and which way that correlation runs.
So that's a great question. I go back to like 2016. Locus of control is very interesting. So, locus of control, the extent to which an individual believes they're in control of the life outcomes. So we have this internal locus of control, or the life outcomes are dictated by powerful others, chance, luck, etc. This external locus of control. Across 2 papers, and I guess 3 now, I found that internalized racism is actually associated with an internal locus of control. Yeah. Okay. So it's like counterintuitive. So as it were, I have developed, so we think about the self-protective function of internalized stigma. So that's like the other way of thinking about internalized racism, that it's one way that individuals use to cope with discrimination. So just again, going back to the opening quote, there are 2 responses to being told that you're lazy of inferior blood. You might fight against it. Which might lead to you being exhausted because every time you hear it, you have to combat it. Or the individual might just be like, you know what, it's true. And just like cope with that in that way. So just accept it. So what I've like seen here is that internalized racism is associated with this internal locus of control, because people who internalize racism are less likely to believe that discrimination is a thing or systemic racism is an issue. And because they're less likely to believe that systemic racism is an issue, they have more of an internal locus of control. And that then leads to positive health outcomes. There's also, I call this like the seemingly protective effects of internalized racism. People have also documented this with women, so internalizing gender stereotypes. So I go to the Berkeley and Blanton paper where women were given a math exam and they were either told that they failed the math exam or they passed the math exam. Women who were told that they failed the math exam were more likely to endorse, to accept or think through stereotypes that women are not good in math. And they found that the women who are more likely to do that also reported higher self-esteem. So here we're seeing that perhaps people might internalize these stigmas as a way to protect their self-concept when faced with discrimination. Okay. I've also found in another study that I'm working in for grad student at OSU that among men who have sex with men, well, men of color who have sex with men, internalized racism is associated, and that's the good and bad thing, it's associated with an increased belief that they're at risk for HIV, which increases the likelihood that they take PrEP. So PrEP here, pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a daily medication that one could take to reduce the risk of HIV. So what we're seeing in the study too is that, internalized racism here is protective because it increases the odds of individual taking PrEP, thereby reducing the likelihood of HIV. But if we think about the cultural context behind it, like, okay, so you're believing all these negative stereotypes about yourself, and as a result, you're believing that there's something about you and your group membership that increases your risk to HIV, therefore engaging in these behaviors to reduce that risk. So I argue that over time, so although it might be self-protective at some points, if you think about every time having to combat it, it becomes exhausting, which might lead to other downstream consequences. So it's like a double-edged sword. And that's a discussion that's also happening. Is it functional or is it just chronic?
Excellent. That's very helpful. So thank you. Good response to the question about locus of control being internal or external. And I appreciate your point that it might seem a little bit counterintuitive the way it's worked out in this model, but very interesting. And I have to say, your path analyses and your sort of structural equation modeling is really, really very precise. Let me scan over the screen here to see if anybody has questions or comments. We like to make this interactive and very informal. Not seeing anything yet. I had a few questions and I thought here's a raised hand. I think Mike's got one.
Yes, great talk. I just had a question. I come from the world of physics and astronomy, so I was wondering, what are your funding sources when you do these studies? Are there agencies that are preferred than others? Are there big grants kind of in the work for this? Because it seems like you're getting large statistics on the national level, and could there be an international statistics?
Right now it's Denison, and I'm hoping during my sabbatical in the spring here to think about federal grant. Because as I said, there's honestly like no research really on internalized racism, no national grants that I'm aware of projects really focused on it, because a lot of the research is focused on the interpersonal. So I hope in the spring to write something that someone will be willing to fund. And I'll also note that across these studies here, I statistically control for this like everyday discrimination. So these effects that we're seeing on internalized racism on these health outcomes account for experiences with discrimination. So over and above the effect of interpersonal discrimination, the relationship between internalized racism and health still holds. Okay, and that's why I'm surprised that we don't study it more. Yeah.
I've received a message that Joan Novak has a question. Joan, delightful to hear from you.
Yes, I'm just kind of curious as to how the stigmatized stereotypes, of groups that are very badly stigmatized in our society are related to other stereotypes that I think all of us have. Like in my small town where I grew up, boys had to play football. I mean, that was whether they liked it or not. And we girls were supposed to love homemaking and get married. And there was, stress related to that too. So I'm just curious how those might relate.
They operate by similar processes, actually. Yeah, so it's in the similar way here. This one, we just focus on race stigma, but we see the same thing here with internalized sexism, internalized mental illness stigma, internalized racism, internalized homophobia, people who internalize stereotypes about athletes. So I've been thinking about this like large scale theorizing about stigma. So as it were, I was invited to write a review paper on the intrapersonal processes involved in internalized stigma. And the model that I presented earlier here is what I argued perhaps is happening with all other stigmatized identities. So you can also think about stigmatized identities. And like I said, when we talk about it, we often think about those negative stereotypes, but we might see the same thing happening here with seemingly positive stereotypes, because as you said here, it's things that we should do. And it's like feeling that we should do it. It's constraining our behavior. It's constraining our self-expression that leads to stress and those poor health outcomes. So I think it's the same process that we're seeing. Yeah.
Great question, Joan. Thank you very much. I'm looking around to see if we have anybody else who would like to unmute and ask a question. All are welcome. And I also have received a question through the chat, which I can read. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay, I'm going to try to read the question from the chat. And this question says, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. My questions are, how are other possible ways to dismantle the internalized stigmas beside cultivating a more external locus of control? And how can we move to a more external locus of control?
Yeah, so I think someone published a paper last year on using cognitive behavioral therapy as a way to reduce internalized racism among African Americans. And the paper really focused on just like positive self-affirmations. That's where we're at right now. It's the only intervention that I'm aware of, because internalized racism is all about those like negative thoughts and feelings about being part of one racial ethnic minority group. Think about like internalized stigma here, the membership to a stigmatized group, or we can think of like all the other stereotypes of like the social groups broadly. And the idea here is to have the individual think about themselves outside the membership of the group. Okay, so think of yourself as an individual, getting those like positive self-affirmations that you're good enough, you're good enough. You work on developing self-esteem, you work on developing self-efficacy, really thinking about giving the individual control or perceived control in their life outcomes. So that's where we're at right now. It was like a really small paper with about, I think, 20 people in like CBT. But I think that's where we should go, especially if we're focusing here on this like self-evaluation. That's perhaps one of the key or major explanatory factors associated with internalized racism with health.
Excellent. Very helpful response. I can see that Dr. Melissa Cypersky is joining us and she has her hand raised. I don't know if she'd like to unmute, but we'd love to hear from you, Dr. Cypersky.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Matthews. Thanks for advertising this talk. It was so great to see it in the newsletter and I'm happy to join. So I work often with the gender diverse community. And so these topics are really of interest to me. And I think the last question was related to mine in terms of thinking about the concept of like racial socialization or queer socialization and how to instill pride and some of the resilient factors that come with pride in self and pride in community, and how can those of us who are, identifying as cis, hetero, white in, privileged groups, how can we foster some more resilience and support in particular?
Oh, that's a great question that I probably haven't thought through in thinking about majority group members and the role they play here in reducing internalized stigma among minoritized people. And I'll just like add that there is research to suggest, for example, I wrote the paper that in like those ethnic identity buffers against the negative consequences of internalized racism on being diagnosed, or the odds of being diagnosed with major depression. So with this like supportive group, positive supportive group orientation seems to help. So I'd imagine then that we might see a similar thing among majority group members step in. But to be honest, I haven't thought about the majority group members then in reducing internalized racism. I've actually only thought about internalized racism among the majority group. So in addition to, we might also see how men internalize stereotypes about men, especially in their interactions with women. We might see the same processes happening among white people and think about the interactions with racial ethnic minorities. So that's the extent to which I've thought about it. So I have to give that more thought. I think that's a great question. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Cypersky, for the question, and thank you, Dr. James, for the answer. Please feel free to unmute to share a comment or an observation if you'd like, or you can put something in the chat and we'll get it read out. While we're waiting for our next question, I did have sort of a fun and very open-ended kind of a question. Dr. James, if you could imagine, and this is sometimes difficult to imagine, given all the constraints that we have when we're teaching and we have many responsibilities on our time, if you had basically unlimited time and you had unlimited financial resources, what kinds of things would you like to ask over the next couple of years?
A longitudinal study.
Longitudinal study, okay.
Yeah, because we have no, beyond there's no really evidence of like how one begins to, or what leads an individual to internalize stigma. We've seen the correlates, those who've been like socialized, those like, it's like competing evidence. Sometimes we see a positive relationship between racial socialization and internalized racism. Other times we see a negative relationship. So maybe it's because of the type of socialization. If you have like positive socializations, you probably have less. If you have more negative, you probably have more. So there's like that. It's a conscious, unconscious process. So going through like what happens, I also want to do some like qualitative work, like really asking people like, do you sometimes, because some of the questions are very blatant. I sometimes hate being Black. So use the word hate in the measures. Yeah. And the extent to which it's surprising the amount of people who strongly agree, amount of Black people who strongly agree that sometimes they hate being Black. And I really want to delve in the future, like why? Like what happened? What are the experiences here that lead you to have those thoughts? You know, you can think of childhood. Was it racial bullying? Was it teasing? You know, are you just frustrated with how your life is going and you blame just being Black as like the main reason why? So there's that. And also thinking about, so in addition to this like longitudinal work, getting at the socialization process, what leads to it, documenting longitudinally like the health outcomes. So right now it's just like correlational. And I'm currently working, well, in the process of thinking about with some people at OSU, at WEX now, to get like the physiological and biomarker correlates of internalized racism. Yeah, so right now it's very much self-report. But we're hoping to collect like blood glucose level and like cortisol levels and even HIV viral loads to see if we're seeing this relationship between internalized racism and health at the biomarker level. So those are all the things that I'm like currently, well, thinking about and wanting to do. That's what it's, I think, sabbatical is going to be important, because I really honestly want to know like why, like, and also to the theorizing. Oh, I'm sorry, John. Yeah, and the theorizing of internalized racism, as you saw, is dated, I think, for good or bad. But I sometimes wonder, like, what does internalized racism look like in 2021? Yeah.
Excellent.
So is it extreme contouring of the nose for Black women? Are we going to put like behavioral things like wearing wigs? Is that a proxy for internalized racism? If we're talking about like excessive like lightening of photos, we can talk about skin bleaching in Jamaica, you know, so like what does it look like? And I'm very curious about that too. Okay, sorry, John. Yes.
Well, I was just wondering, in your factors, the possible factors you listed, I was wondering if young support, like in terms of a loving family or a loving community, might really be a big factor. And I was thinking of a talk I heard very long ago when I was a younger faculty at Denison, and a gay man spoke and said how hard it was because there was no one to relate to when he was a boy, no one to talk to, no one that could say, as say an African-American family might comfort a young person and explain, yeah, this is how it is, you know, that kind of thing. He was very isolated.
Yeah, so this like in-group bonds, perhaps a proxy here, it's like in-group socialization. So another question too is, when we're thinking about some of the factors that might lead to internalize, so people internalizing this like stigmas, do we see a stronger effect for like in-group rejection? So if, for example, you're non-heterosexual and other non-heterosexual people don't enjoy you, you don't have non-heterosexual friends because you don't fit in, would that lead you to internalize this like negative sexual orientation stereotypes more so than being rejected by an individual who is heterosexual? As it were, I have the data to answer that question. I just haven't analyzed it yet. So, you know, when you think about discrimination, oftentimes we think in-group, out-group discrimination. So someone from the out-group discriminating against the individual. But what happens when you have, you know, Hispanic American discriminating against another Hispanic American? Would that lead, you know, the person who experiencing discrimination to even more likely hate being Hispanic American? So what does this process look like? So I agree. It's like, I think, an interesting question too, and added to the list of questions still unanswered on internalized racism, because it's relatively new.
Excellent, excellent. Great question, great answer. So, so thank you for that. We do have time for maybe one more question or so. I do want to be mindful of the time, but we do have time for maybe one more question. I just wanted to comment on Dr. James' response that would certainly be fun to do a longitudinal study. Those are very resource intensive. So that was actually a great response because it takes forever to get those done. And of course, they're also complicated for other reasons. My dad is now 90 years old, so he was born in 1930. And so when you look at the 90-year-olds longitudinally, of course, you have the cohort effect also. There might be something about being in one's 90s. There might be something about being born in the 1930s. And so it takes a lot of resources to try to pull those apart. So I can appreciate the value of a longitudinal study, just how difficult it is to do that well. Also appreciate your desire to want to do some qualitative work and maybe add some possible biomarkers. You referred to cortisol. There's some interesting measures of hair cortisol. So lots of ways to go with this. Let's see if we have anything else in the chat or anybody else would like to raise a hand. Oh, Emily, thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Nemeth.
Thanks for your talk, Dr. James. I was curious as a scholar, teacher scholar, if as you approach your courses and engaging with students at Denison, if you could talk a little bit about how your research has informed your pedagogy when you enter a classroom and see a racially diverse group of students, how you're factoring that in and what kind of moves you're making, or how you've maybe integrated into the kinds of readings you feature in your coursework. So just more generally, pedagogically, and then content-wise, what the impact has been.
Yeah, so introduces me here to my other line of work that I don't talk about a lot. So it's this idea of like this biological constructions of race, so biological racial essentialism. And oftentimes people who have a biological view of race see racial differences as like static, non-changing. So what I try to do when I teach, especially when I teach courses about race, I have students, we introduce the social construction and we're talking about how race is just socially constructed. And there's patterns that we're seeing here that are seemingly racialized and not because of race, but because of like social structures. And I use my own experience as a Black person in the US from the Caribbean. And I talk about how this like, my experience is like very different from the African-American experience. And the only difference here is how I grew up, where I grew up, so the social factors. And if we're saying that race is biological, we should see that, you know, similar outcomes for people in the Caribbean as we do people in the US, but we're not, and trying to understand like why. So that's one, talking about social construction of race. Two, I try to represent, I talk about differences matter-of-factly. I think sometimes people are uncomfortable talking about differences in like outcomes. So I tell my students that yes, we see those differences, but those differences are just that, different, and we shouldn't try to create a hierarchy or moralize those differences. It's like two. The third thing that I do, I oftentimes try to introduce counter-stereotypical information. So little things like if I'm putting my slides together and I have to put a photo of like a family, I'll put a photo of like a Black family. If I'm thinking about a photo, I just did recently, you know, putting a photo on like a construction worker, I look for photos of female construction workers. So really going into those like passive, like, I guess passive showing of like counter stereotypical group information, group imagery. And I don't know if it works because I haven't done it, but I think for me it kind of, and I also try to include like just different examples. If we're thinking about like family, for example, I'll talk about a same gender or same sex family. So just having people think differently about the social group, make them more salient. So, you know, it might at some point override this initial like associations to groups by introducing to something different. So that's how I try to do that. The little things. Yeah.
Thank you for the question and for that response. We're just about at time, and I do want to honor people's commitments. If folks have other things to do this evening, can you please join me one time in thanking Dr. James for an excellent evening and very engaging evening. Thank you, Dr. James, for sharing your experiences with us. Very, very well done. We look forward to hoping that you can join us again on November 11th and December 14th for our next two sessions of Blowing Off Steam.